Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on whatever time you are watching this video lecture. Uh, so, welcome to our first lecture for the midterm, though late. Uh, beg your pardon. So, let us get into medieval philosophy. So, just a short recap. On the previous term, we talked about ancient philosophy, in which we mostly discussed the pre-Socratics. uh, actually failed to be able to discuss more, but at least we were able to understand the notions of what the ancients, or particularly the ancient Greeks, had in mind during their uh, search for the meaning and the origin of life. Now, at this point, we will now discuss medieval philosophy. So, I posted a question a few days ago, or was it maybe last week? And the question being, how do you know that God exists? How can you say that? How can you prove without a shadow of a doubt that there is a God, and not merely out of speculation or mere guessing or personal emotional experiences? Uh, since in philosophy, when we speak of things, we speak of them not in a pretentious intellectual manner. However, we need the intellect in order to be able to at least prove that a certain entity exists. Okay, so if you recall the ancient philosophers or the ancient Greeks, they used their sensory observation to say or to attempt to prove that this is the arche or that is the arche. Like for Thales, that the origin of the arche is water because he observed that water brings life to plants. We need water to survive, things like that. So this is more or less something you can observe. However, with the advent of the fall or of pagan culture, which was replaced by the uh, monotheistic religions of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, we we became humanity during that time period become more concerned as to how life relates to the will of God. And of course, during this time, there were still pagans who clung to their beliefs, and with that, excuse me, and with that, certain questions as to how anyone can prove the existence of a being that cannot be observed. Okay, so of course, no, anyone involved in enrolled in my class, and even I myself, are ardent believers of a divine being who created the world, who created us, and who sees us as his children. However, how can we prove intellectually without our emotions that God truly exists? Right? So that is basically what medieval philosophy revolved around during this time period in human history. Nila makita na as to how the intellectuals of this time, aside from living their lives, attempted to prove that God exists, right? So with that, we will look into two particular philosophers, all right? But before that, take a look into, let us have an overview or a context of what the medieval period was. So medieval philosophy, so it refers to philosophy in Western Europe during the medieval period, the so-called Middle Ages. The notion of a Middle Age, or plural Middle Ages, was introduced in the 15th century for the period between the decline of classical pagan culture in Western Europe and what was taken to be its rediscovery during the Renaissance. Okay, so again, when we say medieval, it is the midpoint between two particular time periods in human history. So Uh, Before the medieval age was the time of the classical pagan cultures dominating Europe. So we have if you're familiar with the show Vikings, there were the Norse gods, and then anim, uh, the fetishists, the animists, and so basically before there was a singular monotheistic religion that dominated Europe, there were a multitude of tribal religions all over Europe. Okay, so these were, as was mentioned earlier, similar to the Vikings, the Norse gods, the fetishists, the animists, those who worship nature. Then later on, with the collapse of the Roman Empire and subsequently the rise of Christianity in Europe, these pagan cultures, these pagan worshippers, slowly declined, and what came to be the rise of Christianity in Europe, particularly Western Europe. And so this is why we see in Europe today that they are mostly Christian nations, right? So with that, the medieval period is again the midpoint, okay, between two particular periods. So during the medieval period, we had an influx of religious belief, particularly the religious belief in a monotheistic God, meaning the people there worshipped one God. Okay, that is with the Abrahamic religion. So when we say Abrahamic religions, we are talking about Judaism, Christianity, Islam, but particularly we're looking into the medieval philosophy of the Christians. Okay. Since all other philosophies are in a way derived or support the two philosophers we are going to speak of, right? So yun. Next, the originators of the notion of the Middle Ages were thinking primarily of the so-called Latin West. Okay, Latin West, the area, roughly speaking, of Roman Catholicism. While it is true that this region was to some extent a unit, culturally separate from its neighbors, it is also true that medieval philosophy was decisively influenced by ideas from the Greek East, from the Jewish philosophical tradition, and from Islam. Okay, so it's excuse me. So in a sense, there are great influences that dealt with how certain Christian thinkers were able to come up with their philosophy. But at this moment, we will take a look first at two philosophers and how they discussed, how they attempted to prove the existence of God. Right? So this will be our first um, discussion for this term. Okay. So in summary, medieval philosophy in general is the utilization of Greek thought in Christian, Islamic, and Jewish belief systems that sought to understand the attributes of the God they believe in and to apply such beliefs into the practical world. Right? So it's not just about being superstitious that porket may pandemic kasi galit ang Diyos. Okay? So, uh, contrary to popular belief, people in this time period, yes, there were a lot of people who was very superstitious. However, there were also those who were reasonable. Okay, these were the thinkers, these were the people who actually thought about being practical as well as being faithful to their beliefs, right? So, going back to the question I posted a few days ago, how can you say that God how can you prove that God exists, or how can you say that God exists? So, if we look back into the comment section, which I will not show here, there were some of the comments, some of the answers were very, how do you say this, emotionally inspired. Or inspired in the sense that it is what you would usually hear from a sermon from your priest, your pastor, your imam, and usually it's not necessarily wrong. Okay, it's not necessarily, but it's also not necessarily right. Okay, so again, since we are in the business of philosophy, we are in the business of trying to figure out why we believe in things, why we say that these things are true, these things are this, these things are that. Okay, so if one need only recall what we discussed regarding what philosophy was. Okay, so this in the wisdom, since we believe that our minds, our creative thought was is derived from a creative God, then let us utilize the creativeness in our minds in order to understand how we can prove or how we can say that God exists, right? So of course, since this is philosophy and this is basically an academic discussion, we let us utilize two particular theories by two particular philosophers during this time period, right? So the first, so the main focus of philosophers was the understanding and justification for the existence of God using ancient Greek thought. Okay, right. So now let us look at the first philosopher we will discuss in this video. Okay, so first is Anselm of Canterbury. Okay, so his birth name was Anselmo de Aosta, born 1033 Aosta Arles, so the Roman Empire, which no longer exists today. And he died in Canterbury, England, and so on and so forth. So he was a monk, a prior, an abbot, and an archbishop. So these are terminologies you do not need to really understand. You can just search them if you want to know what these things are. Okay, so Saint Anselm of Canterbury was a Neoplatonic realist and was often called the Second Augustine. Right. So actually, when we speak of Neoplatonic, actually many of the thinkers of this time period were heavily influenced on Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Okay, we weren't able to discuss them in the previous video, but anyway, perhaps we will create another video for that later on. Okay, so the doctrine of realism implies that the extent to which anything is real is dependent upon its degree of universality. Hence, God is the most real. Other existent things in the world are emanations from archetypes. Okay, so what does this basically mean? What do you mean by uh, we can say that something is real simply because by its degree of universality. So when we say degree of universality, it is the thing that is most commonly thought of. Okay, degree of universality. When I say universality, these are things that wherever you go, these are common concepts. Okay, so when we say degree of universality, this is the thing or this is the entity or the being that everywhere you go, there is a concept that they believe in, even if they believe it in a different way. Okay, so since God then is the most real, so for him, since God is the most common concept that everyone can believe in, even if they believe in him in different ways, then God is the most real. Siya ang pinaka-tinuod na utang sa kalibutan. Okay? So, so other things in the world are emanations from archetypes. Anyway, so let's look at his argument. Okay, so Anselm had what we call the ontological argument. Ontology meaning you look into that which starts from the mind, right? So basically, the general idea of the ontological argument is based on the notion that the concept of God as the greatest being implies that God exists. If not, there could be something greater, namely an existent greatest being, but this being would be God. Alright, so let's try to dissect. Okay, so let's look at it in a logical way. Okay, so the first argument would be, or the first premise would be, we conceive of God as a being that which no greater can be conceived. Okay, so when we think of God, then we will think that there nothing greater can be conceived. In other words, we can think of nothing greater than God, right? We can think of nothing greater than God. Right, next. This being, than which no greater can be conceived, either exists in the mind alone, or both in the mind and in reality. So, the thing that we can conceive, okay, the being in which we consider to be the greatest, either exists only in the mind or exists both in the mind and in reality, right? So where is he going from here? So let us assume that this being, than which no greater can be conceived, exists in the mind alone. So existing both in the mind and in reality is greater than existing solely in the mind. This being, existing in the mind alone, can also be conceived to exist in reality. Okay, this being existing in the mind alone is not, therefore, the being that than which no greater can be conceived. Right. So basically, if, Anselm tries to argue here that if the greatest thing you can think of exists only in the mind, that it cannot be the greatest thing that can be that can be thought of. Okay. So when we say conceived in terms of thinking, we mean thought of. Pinag-isipan. Conceive means pinag-isipan in the philosophical sense. Alright. So, therefore, if God is the greatest thing that anyone can think of, then, according to Anselm, therefore, God should exist not only in the mind, but likewise exist also in reality. Okay? So therefore, this being, than which no greater can be conceived, exists in reality as well as exists in the mind. Right? So, this is the ontological argument. Anselm says, in a nutshell, says that since God is the greatest thing we can think of, then the greatest thing that we can think of should be also be able to exist both in the mind and in the real in reality. Okay, so basically, what we're trying to conceive here is that thinking or assuming, first assuming, thinking about the greatest thing you can think about is equivalent to thinking about God. Okay, so since you cannot think of anything greater than God, then of course, if you think, then that would be God. Diba? The greatest thing you can think of that is in terms of everything you know about the world as well as the mind is God. But if you can think of something greater than God, then that which is greater than God will still be God. Okay? So, Anselm tries to point out here that if we can conceive it in the mind, kung maisip po natin ang konsepto ng Diyos, therefore, kaya siyang mag-exist sa pag-iisip natin. It is possible for us to think of Him or to think of the fact that there is something great that is beyond ourselves. Okay? However, kung hanggang sa isip lang siya, kung tama na siya sa una-una, then that cannot be the greatest thing that can be thought of. Because according to Anselm, the greatest thing that can be thought of should not only exist in the mind, however, should also exist in reality. So therefore, God exists simply because He is something we can think about as the greatest thing, and at the same time, the greatest thing has to exist not only in the mind, but also in reality. Okay? So that is the notion of St. Anselm. It's a bit confusing, yes, simply because for Anselm, he started with the thought, the mental, uh, from thinking, and immediately jumps into reality. And this is actually the problem with the ontological argument. Okay, you begin with ontology, with the thought, with the mind, then you immediately assume that a thing exists simply because you thought of it, right? So if you're watching this, for your assignment on this particular part, research research debunking the ontological argument. Okay, you can find it in YouTube or whatever, in the net in general. How do you debunk the ontological argument or the problem with the ontological argument? Okay, so if you're really watching this, I know it's because you will be doing the assignment. Okay, and post what you understood with what you researched on the comment section under this video. Right, so that is our first philosopher. Okay, for our second philosopher, we have Thomas Aquinas. Okay, since he was born as Tommaso de Aquino, he was educated in the Abbey of Monte Cassino, the University of Naples and Paris. His notable works are the Summa Theologiae, Summa Contra Gentiles, and of course, he belongs to the medieval philosophy era, as well as the region of Western philosophy. Okay, so Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican priest, a theologian, and philosopher. He is called the Doctor Angelicus, or the Angelic Doctor. Aquinas is considered one of the greatest Christian philosophers to have ever lived. Two of his most famous works, the Summa Theologiae and the Summa Contra Gentiles, are the finest examples of his work on Christian philosophy. Okay, so if Anselm had the ontological arguments, Aquinas had the cosmological arguments. So in his Summa Theologiae, Aquinas put forward 5 proofs or 5 ways for the existence of God. The first way is the argument from motion, the second is the causation of existence, third, contingent and necessary objects, the fourth is the argument from degrees and perfection, the fifth way, the argument from intelligent design. Right, so let's look into the argument from motion first. St. Thomas Aquinas, studying the works of the Greek philosopher Aristotle, concluded from common observation that an object that is in motion, let us say the planets, a rolling stone, is put in motion by some other object or force. From this, Aquinas believes that ultimately there must have been an unmoved mover who first put things in motion. Okay, so follow the argument this way. First, nothing can move itself. Okay, if every object in motion had a mover, then the first object in motion needed a mover. Next, movement cannot go on for eternity, for infinity. Okay? Therefore, this first mover is the unmoved mover called God. Okay, excuse me. So it's common sense, no? Walang bagay na makagalaw ng sarili niya. Okay? So even if the doll Annabelle moved, you cannot say that it moved by itself. Diba? If you're familiar with Annabelle, the horror movie, where in which a doll sometimes moves by itself. Of course, then we come to know that the doll is possessed. So basically, it's not the doll that moves by itself, rather than the spirit that possesses it is the one that moves it. Okay? So the same thing applies, that if ikaw, if you are watching this now, whether on the phone or on the laptop, the thing that moved you to watch this is because it is required in my class. Diba? So the thing that moved you to study or to watch this is the fact that you know that it is required by my class. Okay? So, of course, movement cannot move in infinity. Okay? You cannot say, for example, again, my requirements was the thing that moved you to watch this video. The thing that moved me to make this video is the fact that I have a job to do, and it is my responsibility to make sure that you learn. Okay? And it goes on, diba? The reason why there is a system for teaching is because it is required by the government. So the things the teacher does not only is dependent on the responsibility of his mandate, it is likewise moved by a higher authority, which is, let's say, for example, the Commission on Higher Education. Okay? And likewise, CHED moves because the government tells it to move, and so on and so forth, until the conception of the Philippine Republic. Okay? Okay, all of these things here is in motion now because of the decisions of the past. Okay, I hope you understood that, things like that. Okay, so if you keep going back until the dawn of history, of course it cannot go on until hangtod sa hangtod. So it follows a logical conclusion that eventually you're going to have to stop somewhere. Okay, so in the 2,000 year history of the human race, or even longer, it is given, or it is logical to think that eventually you're going to have to go to a certain point in time when nothing was moving. However, there is one entity, there is one being that put everything in motion. Okay, so everything that is happening now is caused by the original entity that made everything as it is now. And the first entity, or the entity that created the first movement, according to Aquinas, is God, who is the unmoved mover. Okay? So he is called the unmoved mover simply because he has to be the origin. Otherwise, there can be no logical explanation as to where we originate every single movement. Okay? So God is known as the unmoved mover simply because no one or no other entity commands him to move other than himself. And it is God himself who commands the movement of every other creation or creature. Okay? So this is the argument for motion. Right? Next we have excuse me, causation of existence. Okay? Kung sa Tagalog, ang dahilan kung bakit ka nandito. Which is a very bad translation. So, causation of existence, ang rason nga no naa ka, the reason why you are here. Okay? So this way deals with the issue of existence. So our previous argument was on motion, movement by itself. Now we look into existence. Okay? Aquinas concluded that common sense observation tells us that no object creates itself. In other words, excuse me, some previous object had to create it. Aquinas believed that ultimately there must have been an uncaused first cause, who began the chain of existence for all things. Right? So we follow the argument this way. There exist things that are caused or created by other things. Okay? Nothing can be the cause of itself, or nothing can create itself. There cannot be an endless string of objects causing other objects to exist. Therefore, there must be an uncaused first cause called God. Okay, so let's say for example the phone or the laptop you are using to watch this video. What created that? Or who created that? Okay, so if you look at the logo on your smartphone or your excuse me, or your laptop, then you will say that it was Asus who made it. It was Acer who made it. It was Samsung. It was Nokia. It was Huawei. So you know that these things you are holding now, the consumer products that you have on your lap or on which you're holding, was created by the corporation that has its brand name on your device. At the same time, the corporations who made what you are using now was created by men and women who had the idea to make the corporation and the company, and created the concept of the designs and the technology you are holding now. Okay, so it makes sense. Likewise, the people who created this were likewise created by their parents. Okay, all right. So I hope you're following. So if we can go on and on, diba? So the people who created Huawei were created by their parents. The people who created their parents were also created by the parents of the parents. And the parents of the parents were created by the parents of the parents of the parents, who are the owners now of the companies who create the devices you hold. Okay, so we can keep going on until how many thousands of years until we see our first Amazon store. Diba? So it's common sense that nothing can be the cause of itself. Okay, so we cannot create ourselves. Okay, so however, at the same time, there cannot be an endless string of objects causing other objects to exist. Hindi pwede na hanggang sa dulo hanggang sa simula, makita mo na may dire-diretso lang ang creation. Diba? There cannot be an endless line of people creating people. Kasi eventually, we will go to our very first human being, whether you believe in evolution or not, you will eventually go to the first being who is the direct line origin of your bloodline. Diba? So therefore, according to Aquinas, it cannot be that you keep going, if you keep regressing to a certain point in time, kasi eventually, maubos yan. Even if you can trace your family lineage up to the first year of human civilization, excuse me, there has to be one entity in which it is the cause for all other causes. Okay? So therefore, for Aquinas, that cause in which we call God is the first cause. Okay? He is the uncaused cause. Because just like no one moves God, likewise, no one or no other entity is the cause for God. No one created God, but it is God who created everything else. Okay? So he created the first man using whatever means he had. Okay? So ayun. So then we have the first man, then the next generations that followed up until the present generation. Okay? So this is how Aquinas explained the causation of existence. Okay? So there has to be an uncaused cause who we call God, who creates, who is the cause for all other creation. Okay? Right. So first we had the argument for motion, now we have the argument for the causation of existence. Okay. So no one exists by themselves, but it is only God who is the cause, the main cause, and is not caused by another cause. Right. The next way is known as the contingent and necessary objects. Okay. This way is sometimes referred to as the modal cosmological argument. Modal is a reference to contingency and necessary. This way defines two types of objects in the universe: contingent beings and necessary beings. A contingent being is an object that cannot exist without a necessary being causing its existence. Aquinas believed that the existence of contingent beings would ultimately necessitate a being which must exist for all of the contingent beings to exist. This being called a necessary being is what we call God. Follow the argument this way. Contingent and necessary objects. First premise, contingent beings are caused. Second, not every being can be a contingent. There must exist a being which is necessary to cause contingent beings. This necessary being is God. Okay, so let's look into this in a more detailed manner, or let's try to explain this as simply as we can. A contingent beings are caused. Okay, excuse me. So I am holding a coffee mug filled with coffee while I am making this video. The contingent being here is the coffee. Okay, it was caused by me. Right. So not every being can be contingent. Alright. The okay. So when we say contingent, these things are, uh, it. For example, you wouldn't exist if it wasn't for your parents. The coffee I am drinking now while making this video was made because of me. Excuse me. So the contingent being here is the coffee. It is, if it wasn't for me, it wouldn't come to existence. Okay? The thing that I am mixing now, if you can hear it, is dependent on the fact that I put hot water on the 3-in-1 in order for me to stay alert. Okay, so the contingent being here is the coffee, and I am the necessary being that made this. However, ako, I am likewise a contingent being because if it wasn't for my parents, I would not exist as well. Okay, so my existence depends on the intercourse of my parents. Alright? So if my parents never met, I would not exist. Okay? So my contingency is I am contingent to the decisions of my parents. Okay? Likewise, my parents are contingent to their parents. Okay? I hope you're following. Okay? So basically, it is similar to the previous uh, proof of Aquinas, no, na causation of existence. But basically, we are talking about the necessity of a certain creator. Okay, so basically, you who are watching this video and hopefully listening is dependent. You have your existence is dependent on the actions of your parents years ago. Okay, so if they didn't get married, you wouldn't exist today. Okay, and likewise, that your parents are similarly dependent on the actions or the decisions of your grandparents. Because if your grandparents never met, your parents wouldn't exist, and subsequently, you wouldn't exist. Right? So the same argument follows. You cannot have a continuous regression of contingent beings. Because eventually, there has to be one necessary being. Okay? So when we say necessary, it is the one that has no contingent. It is the one who is, of course, when we say necessary, uh, all everything wouldn't exist if it wasn't for this one being, this one entity. Okay? So since God, we cannot say that God is contingent simply because that would mean that He is not God. Okay? God is not contingent. Otherwise, if God was contingent, then He would not be God. And therefore, we will look to another necessary being. And that necessary being would be God. Okay? So when we say necessary, it has to be there. Okay? Otherwise, everything else would not follow. That's what we mean by necessary. When we say contingent, it would mean that we can exist, but at the same time, there would be no consequence if we did not exist. Okay? So, if, for example, the creator of Huawei or Samsung, if they did not exist, then someone else would have had made their own version of what we now know as Samsung and Huawei. Okay? So because they are contingent beings, they may not have existed, but they exist simply because of the decisions of other contingent beings. But again, there has to be one necessary being for the creation of every other contingent being. Otherwise, there would be no existence at all. Okay? So, I hope we clear that. Or if again, no, if you have any confusion, you are free to comment on the comment section in order for us to have a fruitful discussion. Alright, so this is contingent and necessary objects, okay, or let's say beings. Next, we have the argument from degrees and perfection. Okay. So Thomas formulated this way from a very interesting observation about the qualities of things. For example, one may say that of two marble sculptures, one is more beautiful than the other. So for these two objects, one has a greater degree of beauty than the next. This is referred to as degrees of gradation of a quality. From this fact, Aquinas concluded that for any given quality, that is, say, goodness, beauty, knowledge, there must be a perfect standard by which all such qualities are measured. These perfections are contained in God. Okay, so let's look at the argument. Okay, so that is the argument. Excuse me. So basically, when we say argument of degrees and perfection, of course, when we say, let's say, for example, if let's go back to the first degree of your known relatives. Let's say, for example, your grandparents. Okay. When we say degrees and perfection, let us look first at the qualities of your grandparents. Okay. So let's say, for example, your grandparents had a certain look. Okay. Siguro they can have a big forehead, a sharp, matangos na ilong, uh, big cheekbones, curly hair. When your parents were born, and eventually they grew up to what they are now, if you were to look at the pictures of your grandparents and your parents, you would say that they have similar features. Okay? So, yun. I hope take a look at the pictures of your parents and your grandparents. And now compare your own picture, your own likeness, your own bearings to the, the images of your parents and your grandparents. Okay? So as you can see, even though you have, in a way, you may have similar facial features, physical build, or even degrees of knowledge or interests, at the end of the day, yes, you may be of the same bloodline, you may have similar features, but eventually you will see that as each generation passes its own genes to the next, there will always be a different degree of what a certain face looks like. Okay? Of course, that would be our simplified example. Now, if we look at the concept of God, since God is perfect, no, since God is the ultimate point of the pyramid of genealogies of genes, then we would say that His perfection is passed down to each generation. Okay. However, for each generation that follows, the degree is different from that of the origin. Okay? So kung anong perfection ang meron sa Diyos, kung anong mabigay sa mga anak niya, okay? Then each degree is passed on in a different way. Okay? So that is why humanity itself is not perfect. Okay? Simply because by degrees, we tend to have a different adaptation of the quality. Okay, so basically, how do we say it? It's quite a bit complicated to try to simplify it, no? Pero the point here lang here is each particular concept or each particular individual is of course created by God. Okay, so we see that in the previous arguments. Okay, in the long run, we are moved by God, we are caused by God, and God is the necessary being, and we are the contingent beings. And each of us, in the end of the day, is still a member of that, how do you say this? Of that creative creation. We are all creation. We are all creatures of God. In other words, and each of us, being creatures of God, we have our own particular look. We have our own particular principles, and each of these principles are varying degrees of the perfection of God. Okay, so the entirety of perfection is in God alone, and within those degrees, in every other individual, there are different forms of that perfection. So basically, because there are different forms of that perfection, which comes from God, we ourselves may not be perfect, but we reflect a certain perfection from God. Okay, so that like for example, you can say that this person is more handsome than this person. This person is more beautiful than this person. This person is smarter than this person. Okay, so these are similar explanations to what we tried to explain with the yung imagery of your grandparent, your parent, and you. Okay, so basically, it is with that we understand that it we basically inherit, or perhaps that's not the right word. We basically have within ourselves a certain amount of that perfection that comes from God, right? And therefore, because of that, we have to understand as well that if all the with all the creatures of the world combined, we make up the understanding that there is one in which it's the origin of this certain perfection. Okay? So if you think you're beautiful, then God is more beautiful. If you think you're smart, God is smarter. If you think you're good, God is more good, or good. There's no, yeah. So yes, that is basically the argument from degrees and perfection, right? Lastly, we have the argument from intelligent design. Okay, so the final way that St. Thomas Aquinas speaks of has to do with the observable universe and the order of nature. Aquinas states that common sense tells us that the universe works in such a way that one can conclude that that it was designed by an intelligent designer, God. In other words, all physical laws and the order of nature and life were designed and ordered by God, the intelligent designer. So, excuse me. So, basically, or fundamentally, uh, we take for example again the technology you are using to watch this video. Whether it's a smartphone, whether it's a laptop, you have to consider that the thing you are holding, the thing in which you are using to make sure that you have a education still, or for you to enjoy your day, was created by an intelligent designer. Okay, so imagine all the possibilities of learning, all the possibilities of entertainment, all the possibilities of working, of making money, are all in one device. Okay, uh, with this laptop, you can have an online job, you can have an online business, and at the same time, you can learn, and at the same time, you can connect with other people. So it takes a very intelligent person to create what we now take for granted, which is the technology we have, right? So the same concept goes with everything else. All of us that are organic, if you consider your own body, no? If you consider your own body, how is it that your feet can let you stand, diba? How is it that your hands, how is it, how are your hands designed in such a way that you can pick up whatever you see, most of the things you see. Okay, how is it that your eyes are made in such a way in which you cannot just see for the sake of seeing, but you can also appreciate beauty? How is it that your nose was designed in such a way that you can decide or you can judge whether something smells good or bad? Okay, how is it that our internal organs were arranged in such a way, excuse me, were arranged in such a way that no organ gets in each other's way, and they all interact with one another in such a way that they help put homeostasis in the body. Okay, so the same thing applies with technology to everything in the world, from your body to the laws of nature to the understanding of morality and ethics. Okay, it is for according to Aquinas, that is an indicator that we are not made in random. Hindi random ang paggawa natin sa paggawa sa mundo. So, it is basically the world is created by one who is intelligent, one who made sense of how things work. Okay? Like, when does a coconut tree bloom at a certain time of day? At a certain time in the season? Or how is it that for some reason we are able to have rain at random moments and then we didn't realize that we needed the rain, diba? So these are the laws of the world. These are the laws of our biological nature. These are the things in which we come to understand, or we, at least for Aquinas, no? And we try to come to understand that things, even the things that we do not appreciate, tend to be are thought of as the design of some of one with a great mind. Okay, everything is so convenient for us now, but even before technology, before the rise of the internet, before any other form of technology, humans had the capabilities to be able to create what we have now. And it is with the complexity of our mind that we have a reflection of the complexity of what the one we call God. And so this ends our video for this particular topic. So I hope you were able to get something out of this, despite the many confusion and the many uh, over explained certain concepts that are quite and in a way not that simple to understand, not that quick to understand, but still, I hope you got something out of this today. So thank you for your time. I'll see you in the next video. Stay safe, God bless, and study hard.